Yeah, the report that we're releasing today, as Mark said, takes as a starting point the Census Bureau projections and then varies things to see what we get. Oh, before I get started, I do want to mention there is actually a co-author on this report. One of the center demographers, Karen Ziegler, is also the other person. She's not here today, but I wanted to acknowledge that she helped me write the report and do the research. I'd also like to acknowledge the demographers at Decision Demographics, Stephen Tordella's outfit, that also helped us develop these projections as well. As I say, they are based on the most recent Census Bureau projections that were re-released. There was a correction made, and they were released in September of last year, the newest versions. We then vary the immigration component to see its impact on the size and age composition is our main focus here of the U.S. population. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about methodology, though we can have that discussion as well, nor am I going to talk about all the Census Bureau assumptions, though we could talk about that too. Rather, I'm going to focus on findings. In my comments, I should also point out I will use rounded numbers just to make the discussion easy about future population, how many people coming, that sort of thing. Now, the Census Bureau projects that net future immigration between now, or 2017, and 2060, that's their takeoff date, will total about 46 million people. Net immigration is the difference between people coming versus going. And they project a population of 404 million by 2060, or 79 million larger than in 2017. Now, varying the immigration component shows that immigration will account for about 95% of that population increase, or about 75 million. That is, immigration will add 75 million people to the U.S. population in about 4 decades. So that is a population equal to roughly the population of France. Now, of course, that's comparing zero immigration with Census Bureau immigration. And zero net immigration in the future is unlikely, as the U.S. has always had some immigration, not as high today necessarily always, but still some. Now, we can compare the census level of immigration to what would happen if immigration was cut by 2/3. Now, we do a lot of comparisons, which I can't run through them all in the report, but let's talk about that 2/3 cut, because it's kind of interesting, because it is the level that would roughly stabilize the U.S. population after, say, 2040. So now, even in that stabilization scenario, you still have nearly 400,000 net arriving each year, 370,000. And you still get a population that's about 29 million larger than it is today, but 50 million less than the Census Bureau projects. So you still get a significant amount of population growth under that sort of low or stabilization projection or scenario, but not what you would get under the Census Bureau. So again, 29 million growth with a stabilization projection, because it stabilizes after 2040, as compared to 50 million growth if we go with the Census Bureau projections. Now, I'd like to talk very briefly, which I don't do in the report, but I think is important. I think it's a discussion worth having. What does it mean to have 75 or 50 million more people in the United States? Let's just consider an issue like traffic. As a Brookings Institution analysis a number of years ago concluded, quote, the most obvious reason traffic congestion has increased everywhere is population growth. In a recent book, the author estimates $120 billion net cost to the U.S. economy just from traffic congestion. Now, like anything else, traffic has many causes, not just population. But it's clear from the research that population size has a significant impact. Now, beyond the issue of traffic, there is the larger issue of the nation's infrastructure problems, sometimes referred to as the infrastructure gap. There is widespread agreement that the nation's roads and bridges and other transportation systems are in need of serious repair. You can look at what the American Society of Civil Engineers says, the Department of Transportation, but roughly speaking, it's thought that we need to spend about $1 trillion more on infrastructure in the next few years to update things, to keep up, to maintain, and so forth. Now, in a nation that is finding it difficult to keep up with the maintenance on existing infrastructure, it is hard to imagine that adding tens of millions of more people will not make that problem worse. Now, of course, it's true that with immigration you have more people, to help you pay for the more infrastructure you're going to need. But again, if the average is not currently maintaining the infrastructure, it's hard to see how adding more people who will also not help maintain that infrastructure will make it any better. Equally important, of course, for the immigrants to pay for the infrastructure, they'd have to be some kind of fiscal boon, that is, paying a lot more in taxes than they use in services. And there's no research to indicate that is the case. The most detailed estimates of the current fiscal estimates of immigrants and their dependent children was done in 2007 by the National Academy of Sciences. They ran 8 different scenarios looking at taxes paid and services used, and they all came out negative. Now, I would say that it is possible that the children of today's immigrants may become at least average taxpayers at some point. But then again, just making them average again wouldn't help us with our infrastructure problem. You'd still have the same problem of adding more people like we have now, and the same problem of underfunding would only be made worse with a larger population. Now, in addition to infrastructure, there is the issue of the environment. It's long been recognized that population size has important implications for the environment. As the former director of the United Nations Population Division, Joseph Chamy, who is American and a very moderate voice on issues of immigration and population and the environment, has observed there have been various high-level commissions in the United States over the decades that have looked at population growth, and all have concluded, and this is Chamy's words, there is hardly any problem confronting America whose solution would be easier with a larger population. He further points out that these commissions have all found that stabilizing the population would be very helpful to dealing with issues associated with energy and resource consumption, climate change, and environmental stability and stabilization. I should say sustainability. Now, finally, let me just add one other issue. There is the issue of political representation and population growth. At the time of the last census in 2010, each member of Congress represented about 710,000 constituents. If immigration unfolds as the Census Bureau expects, they're going to represent about 930,000 constituents. The same thing happens, of course, at the state and local level. Making the population a lot larger is likely to exacerbate the sense among many Americans that government is too distant and unresponsive. So these are just some of the issues that I think we want to think about when we think about making our population so much larger. I'd like to return to focus on the report a little bit and its second key finding, not just this larger population, but the impact on the age structure in the United States. Now, many have argued that without immigration, there will not be enough workers to support the government or the economy. Among those who've made this argument are Jeb Bush and the late Charles Krafthammer. Now, there's a lot of inherent plausibility here. After all, immigrants arrive young and do have somewhat larger families. And of course, Americans are living longer and having fewer children. Yet, as the projections show, immigration's ability to, quote, rebuild the demographic pyramid, as Jeb Bush put it in 2013, is actually quite limited. For example, we found that in 2060, 59% of the population will be of working age if immigration unfolds as the Census Bureau projects, but this compares to 58% under the stabilization scenario I mentioned. That's cutting immigration by 2/3. A positive effect of immigration, but small. Looking at the ratio of potential workers to retirees also shows a not modest impact, but a little better impact there. None of that is inconsistent. This idea that immigration can have a small positive effect on the age structure, but only a small one, is consistent with the prior research. A 1992 article in Demography concluded, which is the top demographic journal in the field, concluded constant inflows of immigrants, even at relatively young ages, do not necessarily rejuvenate low fertility populations. In fact, immigration may even contribute to population aging in the long run. As the Census Bureau said in a report in 2000, immigration is, quote, a highly inefficient means for increasing the percentage of the population that is of working age. Our analysis simply confirms that older research. I could discuss at length why immigration has this modest effect on aging, but let me just explain it very briefly. Immigrants are not just a demographic abstraction. They are not simply the idealized young workers in perpetuity that some immigration enthusiasts seem to imagine. For one thing, immigrants arrive at all ages. The latest Census Bureau data on new arrivals in 2017 shows that about 1 out of every 7 new legal immigrants is over the age of 50. Look at an issue like fertility. The total fertility rate of immigrants is now barely above 2.1. That is the level of children that a woman would expected to have in the course of her lifetime, given current patterns, and that is just about the replacement level of fertility. It's higher than natives, but not that much higher. If you look at the impact of immigration on fertility in the United States, it raises the fertility rate, or the total fertility rate, by about 5%. So it's positive, but quite small. Now, one of the things we did do in the report is we looked at what would be necessary if we wanted immigration to maintain the ratio of workers to retirees. But to do that, it would require a level of immigration at about 5 times what the Census Bureau projects. It would produce a population of 706 million in 2060, more than double the current population. Put a different way, to preserve the working age population, it would require growing the U.S. population by 376 million. So it doesn't seem like that's much of an option. Now, alternatively, raising the retirement age by 2 years, even assuming zero net immigration, as I said, is unlikely, has about the same impact on the retirement, actually a slightly better impact on the retirement age in terms of looking at the share of workers who are of working age than does the 46 million net immigrants who are supposed to come in the next 4 decades. It also has a similar impact on the ratio of workers to retirees. So, in other words, just raising the retirement age can replicate the effect of all the immigration the Census Bureau projects. Now, one other way to deal with the decline in the working age is to increase the share of working age people who are actually employed. At present, the employment rate, the share who actually have a job of 16 to 64-year-olds, is about 70%. 70% of them work. Increasing the employment rate to 75%, which is almost what it was as recently as 2000, would have the same impact on the share of the population who are actually workers as would the immigration projected by the Census Bureau. As I think Nick can tell you, working age people, particularly men not working, is associated with a lot of very negative social outcomes. So increasing the share of people who have a job, particularly these idle men, would be a good idea regardless of any other consideration. But in terms of this discussion, it is important because it's another way of dealing with the potential decline in the working age share. In conclusion, it's clear that the impact of immigration on the size of the U.S. population is very large, and this does have important political, environmental, infrastructure, and quality of life implications. And although immigration makes the United States population much larger, it doesn't really fundamentally remake the demographic pyramid, again, to use Jeb Bush's term. It doesn't significantly, or dramatically, I should say, or only modestly, maybe is a better way to put it, changes the ratio of workers to retirees or the share of the population that is of working age. It would require a truly dramatic level of immigration to do that. That seems totally implausible, and no one that I know of is seriously arguing that. Therefore, the debate over immigration should focus on issues like population growth and what does it mean to make a much larger population. Now, of course, this report doesn't tell us what are all the costs and benefits. I've mentioned some here in my discussion. Instead, the report tells us, if you will, where we're headed as a nation. What we have to decide as a country is, do we want to go there? No one has a right to come to America. And if we wish, we could reduce immigration. We could also increase it or keep it the same. That's up to us based on what we think makes sense for our country. What these projections show is one of the impacts that's undeniable: population growth. Thank you.